Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this session. So the talk in the coming half an hour will be about excipients and how to prepare the new European guidelines actually on excipients. Now, before I get started, I'd like to get a feel about the audience. So would you mind indicating who in the audience is actually an excipient producer? All right. The remaining ones, is that all pharmaceutical industries, pharmaceutical manufacturing? Okay, interesting. And then a second question, who of you is active in quality, compliance, regulatory? All right. And who of you in procurement, in purchasing? Okay, so there's a lot of hands not raised, so that's a guess then in what department they're active at. But anyway, okay. So what will we talk about? About new guidelines on excipients. Now the new guideline actually is applicable to the Manufacturing Authorization Holder, but they apply directly to the excipient. And I'm going to give you the perspective from Capsugel, and Capsugel having a business unit in capsule manufacturing as excipients, and that's the area of my responsibility. I'm a quality and regulatory responsible for capsule manufacturing. So when we talk about the new guidelines, I do want to give you a little bit of market background, and that market background, I guess, is not at all a surprise to you. We're talking about a globalized environment where there are a lot of challenges to be addressed and that are asking for some robust measures to mitigate all the risks associated with that globalized environment that have led to some updated legislation. And then on the other hand, we have the concept of quality by design, which expects, and maybe I'll pause for 1 minute because that's quite disturbing. All right, we can go further. So the second market context is definitely the concept of quality by design, where there is an expectation that the excipient really needs to be very well understood in terms of impact on the safety and efficacy of the drug. So with those two elements already in mind, now we are going to turn to the excipient industry. And everybody who is active in excipient industries definitely will confirm that excipient origins can be widely spread. We are talking about excipients with starting materials from various natures, animal, mineral, vegetal, chemical, and so on. There is various manufacturing processes that are applicable in excipient manufacturing, and both of that have led to a wide variety of quality systems that are applicable in excipient industries, certainly in those industries that are not dedicated to pharmaceutical manufacturing. So from that perspective, if I would have the time, I could do a sort of poll in the audience and asking you, please give me your top 10 or top 5 risks that you think are associated with excipients. And I'm sure that some of you would say, well, there's a risk of viral safety with my excipient. There's a risk of process residues with excipients. There is a risk of maybe impurities that are present. There might be some unknown factors that in the end have an impact on my labeling, on my dossier. Others might say, well, a risk associated with an excipient is the fact that there can be an interaction with my API and in the end, affect my drug efficacy. And then others might say, well, my main concern in the risk of an excipient is related to the fact that it may be falsified or that it might degrade during transport and during warehousing. So if you wish, I already grouped these various risks in 3 key pillars. And we could easily summarize these in 3 key risk domains associated with excipients. The one being risks associated with safety, integrity, consistency, risks associated with the functionality of the drug, and risks associated with traceability and supply chain. So what is now the purpose of the new European guidelines, because we need to come to the topic, is actually that there is a requirement, now a legal requirement for excipients to comply with GMP and GMP being the most preferred or an excellent tool or a control measure to actually control of those possible risks. And not any kind of GMP, it needs to be the appropriate GMP. So already somewhat vague. So let's walk now through the actual guideline and try to make that a bit more familiar. For those who have read the guideline, and we are talking here about the formalized risk assessment that needs to be conducted on excipients to determine the appropriate level of GMP. That's the actual European guideline that was published in March this year. So more in detail, and before going there, actually, indeed, it might be useful to understand that anybody who is active in excipients will confirm that until 2011, it is not an authority-controlled environment. We are obviously strongly controlled by the market, by our customers that help us determine what is needed. But from an authority direct inspection in Europe, the excipient industry was not very much exposed. So it took until 2011. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a bit too quick. So it took until 2011, with the publication of the Falsified Medicines Directive, that actually a new guideline was published in March this year, with a deadline for implementation in March 2016, which requires that all manufacturing authorization holders need to do a formalized risk assessment on each of their excipients. So let us go a bit more in detail and look at the process. So what needs to be done? The first step that needs to be done is you need to list, if you're not that done so, but the exercise is actually conducting a listing of all your excipients and verifying the potential risk of that excipient, independent from the supplier, just the excipient by itself, and checking the source of the excipient, so any risks associated with the origin, the starting materials, the source of the excipient, risks associated then with the use and the function. Remember, the functionality risk is embedded in the exercise, and that requires you already to do a risk rating of the excipient by itself. If it is a high-risk excipient, this is a low-risk excipient. Next step in the process is that the pharmaceutical industry is expected then to determine, depending on the risk level, what level of GMP does that excipient need to adhere to when they are manufacturing it. Next to that, you bring in the picture of the actual supplier and the manufacturer of the excipient, and you perform a gap analysis. Depending on that gap analysis between what you want and what your supplier is capable of, we as industry are capable of, there needs to be an appropriate control strategy that makes sure that all these risks are mitigated and are controlled. And of course, it's not a one-time exercise. It requires ongoing risk review by a longer-term monitoring, taking into account potential changes that might take place on the excipient, so that constantly that control strategy is taking control over these potential risks that we said in the beginning. So let's now, for each of the steps, and not too much in detail, but let's pause a minute in the first step of the process. So the pharmaceutical industry needs to risk rate all the excipient in a formalized way and taking into account the source and the use and the function of the excipient. So, some questions then to the pharmaceutical industry. You probably already have a good supplier qualification process in place. Question is, does that current supplier qualification process actually takes into account the starting material of the excipients? Are you aware of how the excipients actually are produced? What are the potential risks coming from the manufacturing process? Are you aware of the original producer? If it's a complex supply chain, you really need to go until that level of the original producer. Do you know the level of line clearance that is applied at that manufacturer? So a number of questions that the European guideline asks you to consider and take into account in the risk rating of that excipient. And likewise, when you go to the next step, not the next step, but within the same risk rating of the excipient, Also, the use and the function of the excipient needs to be taken into account, and that, we guess, will probably already be embedded in current procedures. But indeed, how important is that excipient in my drug product in the end? What is the potential impact on the critical quality attributes? What is the proportion of that excipient in the final drug product? What is the pharmaceutical form and use which might trigger a different risk level of the excipient in itself? So, I mean, this is, in a nutshell, I think, in the first step, risk rating of the excipient. We, as excipient industry, I think, see one important process here taking place. If that information is not yet known, really please go into dialogue with the manufacturer of your excipient, of the starting materials, because they have that knowledge in-house. And it's truly important to have that dialogue and partnership between excipient users and excipient producers. So that data gathering step is actually consisting of make sure you get a set of compliance declarations from your excipient producers, because there's a lot of legislative guidance when we talk about allergens, residual solvents, elemental impurities. There's a whole wide variety of good legislative guidance that can help you to get a set of compliance declarations from your excipient suppliers. Make sure you link that with your QBD exercise. Does that excipient have yes or no functionality-related characteristics? Do you know, have you got information on the transport condition, warehousing conditions? So go into that dialogue with your excipient manufacturer. So, second step is, what is the required level of GMP? And let's go in a bit more detail. No, I'm sorry, I'm going back here 1 minute. What is the required level of GMP? With an industry standard already available, who knows IPEC here in the room? Okay, good. So IPEC is the International Pharmaceutical Excipients Council. They have an IPEC GMP standard, which very likely will be a sort of standard reference that the pharmaceutical industry will refer to. Even though a lot of other quality systems might be in place, the European guideline clearly states that, independent on the risk level, that is all the excipient GMP standards that need to be in place, minimum principles that need to be in place, and IPEC GMP definitely already covers this. Next step in the process is, you've done your risk rating of your excipients, you need to bring in now the supplier, the actual manufacturer. Do a gap analysis there with your current suppliers. Are they capable to meet your requirements? Also here, data gathering. Make sure you know your suppliers. You go back to the actual producers. What certifications does he hold? What audit results? What variability that excipient causes in your manufacturing? And then, as a next step, and the most important step probably is, you've done your risk rating, you've established what you want, you do your gap analysis with your current suppliers, and then, of course, you need to control maybe some gaps. There might be some gaps. How do you control gaps? Well, that is then the control strategy. You can either accept the residual risk because it's minor, or you can actually try to reduce it. And that's where the control strategy comes into place. So depending on the risk level of your excipient supplier, you might actually decide, if the gap is extremely large, to spend a lot of resources in trying to compensate for that gap by more testing, by more frequent focused auditing, by maybe setting up quality agreements with specific sections, focusing on those gaps that you have identified. Or if your supplier is a non-gap supplier, you might even go to a very lean control strategy, right? So that is actually what the European guideline requires the pharmaceutical industry to do as an exercise, formally, on paper, by March 2016, right? Now, let's spend another minute in just showing you, as a capsule manufacturer, as an excipient manufacturer, how we have approached the topic and how we think we can help the pharmaceutical industry to comply with these guidelines. So actually what we did is, 1 minute. Just, I'm not going to spend too much time in explaining Capsugel. I think you know Capsugel is a capsule manufacturer. And we have actually also a second business unit for dosage form solutions with very specialized applications and a lot of other services based on science and engineering that you might be interested in. And you can easily find us here at CPHI. But let's go back to what we've done in this European guideline context. So I'm sorry, the slide is not very clear, but it's just, remember the process that we just talked about. So the first step of the process is the entire pharmaceutical industry, if they're actually working on that guideline, they need to go into that step of data gathering and documenting the risk of the excipient and the supplier. So what we did is Capsugel developed a compliance support package and has been granted Excipact GMP certification, which is an independent third-party evidence that we comply with the GMPs. In the second step of the process, which is more the ongoing review and the control strategy, we are working with partnerships, quality review meetings. We do change notifications to the market, which both of them can potentially lead to a very lean control strategy for the pharmaceutical industries when they control our products. So going back to the first one, the compliance support package. So we've built a very extended package of compliance declarations with all the associated risks for the starting materials of our capsules, so that all our customers have that on hand and can demonstrate to inspectors that they have all the information in hand to risk rate our capsules. So it's a sort of effort-free online available package. Secondly, we have been granted an excipient GMP certification. So the key thing of the guideline is that there is an expectation that the pharmaceutical industry only purchases from capable and reliable suppliers, and they have the burden of proof. They need to demonstrate that their suppliers comply. So we inversed it. We took the responsibility and we said, well, let's try ourselves to provide that evidence into the market that we comply with that GMP by being granted that Excipact certification, which is an independent third-party certification of IPEC GMP compliance. What's the value there? Indeed, it could potentially replace the resource-intense process of auditing, and it bridges the gap between probably the required GMPs, because of course we're in business 40 years and we know that IPEC GMP is a reference. So from that perspective, that certificate will definitely help to in the process, in a resource lean way actually, to be compliant with the guidelines. Going to then that control strategy, remember in the process, what we've done there is we build partnerships. We do change notifications because the pharmaceutical industry constantly needs to know if I'm changing something or if the excipient supplier is changing something, could that potentially lead to my risk rating and change that risk rating and potentially change my control strategy. So we as excipient industry have the responsibility to assess our own internal changes, determine whether they can have an impact, and proactively communicate that into the market. And that's exactly what we do. So from that perspective, our customers already have that feeling of reassurance that they don't need to go and get that information, but they'll get it from Capsugel. And then, as said, the last piece in the control strategy is if the excipient supplier shows to be capable and reliable, I think we can help the pharmaceutical industry by offering lean control strategies, being control delegation, but in full compliance with the European GMP Chapter 5, which outlines some clear conditions before which obviously you can go into that path. But our viewpoint there is that if we are capable with a reliable source and a capable supplier and the available certifications, we can help the pharmaceutical industry to free much more resources to what actually really counts, and that is in essence developing medicines. So I think with this, in a nutshell, I think we can come to the conclusion saying that when we talk about excipient risk and excipient control, because risk is a rather negative word, for every risk you can have a control measure in place, right? So how do we control that excipient? First of all, I believe there needs to be a good understanding of the legislative requirements. There needs to be a good understanding of the potential impacts on the product quality, safety, efficacy. Remember that functionality risk. And there needs to be a very good understanding of the source. Where do you get your excipient from? Who is a producer? What were the starting materials? And what are all these risks associated with this? So with this in mind, we as excipient makers, producers, have a strong responsibility from the moment you engage yourself in pharmaceuticals. There are certain consequences. So that the European guideline now imposes formally GMP in the excipient world, I think is a good thing, because it actually reinforces that commitment to the pharmaceutical industry. Now, of course, it needs to be appropriate and in proportion to the risk. I don't think we kill a fly with a shotgun either. So everything risk needs to be balanced and proportionate with the measures taken. On the other hand, we have the pharmaceutical industry as excipient users also having a strong responsibility, because they need to tell us what we need to adhere to, what level of GMP is actually required. They need to gather process knowledge and product capabilities of the excipient industry. They need to know their excipients really in depth. And I think also an important message, if you look to the control strategy that I've shown, when we talk about cost of excipients, it's not about that purchase cost that is the only driving factor. If as a consequence of the purchase cost, but with a poor reliable and poor capable supplier, you need to invest in a very intense control strategy. The resources that go into that needs to actually be added to that purchase cost to give you the full picture. So when we are talking about excipient control and excipient risk, I think both here in the room have very strong responsibilities. The European guideline is actually reinforcing this, and we as an excipient maker are embracing that new step into that process and hoping actually that it will give us safer and better medicines to the patients. So I hope that was clear. Thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, you certainly are able to find me either at the booth or via my email address or any other means that is available. So thank you for your attention.